Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to do step one of setting our template onto the block. So step one is setting the location of the CO2 chamber. So what you're going to do is you're going to cut out the entire outline of the entire block on your final draft. Okay. If I made any comments like parts of it are too narrow or too close to the bottom, the whole axle holes are too close to the bottom, you need to make those changes before you start. But my final draft is perfect. So I'm just going to be cutting out the whole outline of the entire block. Now, and then also I need to cut out the CO2 chamber. So first I'm going to just cut the CO2 chamber out. Try to be careful with cutting it out. Make sure it's not too long. Make sure it's just the right length, right? So I'm just going to set this piece aside. Okay, and then I'm just going to continue cutting out the entire outline. You're not going to cut out the outline of the shape of your CO2 car. You're going to cut out the entire block. And you're going to do that with the front view and the top view. So I'm just going to pause this right now and you can continue cutting. So you should pause your video also. So right here, you can see I've cut out the entire front view of my CO2 template, and then I'm going to start cutting out the top view. So the first thing I'm going to do is just make sure I cut out that CO2 chamber. Because we're going to need to put an outline of that on the block. You just put that aside. And then I'm going to cut out the remainder of the entire outline of the block. Okay. Now, some of you might be wondering now why I am not cutting out the outline of my actual CO2 car. And that's because using the shape of the entire block helps me locate the CO2 chamber accurately. And that's what we're doing. That's that step that we're doing now. Is this. So I'm going to pause while I cut out the rest, and you can pause while you cut out the rest. Okay, so you can see here I have the entire template of the front view of my CO2 car, and along with the CO2 chamber cut out. And I'm just going to lay that on the block and line up my template the best I can. So the most important thing here, my template's a little bigger than my block is. I'm not sure. These blocks are a little smaller than we've had in the past. The most important thing is that you have the bottom left edge right here, okay, and the back edge lined up so we can properly locate our CO2 chamber. And I'm just going to use a nice sharp pencil to, hold that firmly in place so it doesn't move around while you're tracing. And you're just going to trace around. Oh, it's okay if your CO2 chamber tracing ends up too big or a little bit sloppy. It's better for it to be a little too big than not big enough. Okay, so that's where my CO2 chamber is. So if I could see through the block and if my block was transparent, that's where it would be. It looks like that's not placed properly. These are old blocks from like last year, so these are not quite right. Okay, and then I'm going to flip over the block. Notice I flip the block over and I flip my paper over. If I don't flip my paper over, it doesn't quite fit because it's not the same shape. So I'm just going to put this on the back edge, trace around where my CO2 chamber is. Okay, and then take this and put it off to the side. Okay, all right. So I've got the CO2 chamber traced on both sides. Okay, and then I'm going to do the same with the top view. I'm going to lay this block on so the top is facing me. I'm going to lay this template across the top. Now, notice this isn't lined up, so I want to make sure I line this up as best I can. And the most important thing is that your back edge is lined up. So if the blocks, you got to remember, the blocks are manufactured in such a way that there might be some irregularities with the shapes. So that's why we don't cut too close to the CO2 chamber. And then I'm just going to hold this in place with one hand while I trace with the other. . 'Cause It doesn't have to be beautiful. Any of these marks that we're making, you can sand off later on. If you're using a pen, I don't recommend using a pen. Using a pencil is best because pencil sands off really easily. You can even erase it. And then we're going to flip the block over and then do the same thing. We're going to locate the CO2 chamber on the bottom. Make sure the whole thing is lined up. Hold it in place. And then trace. Okay. So now I've got my CO2 chamber located and I'm done with this step 1.